Well, thank you for two very interesting and challenging presentations. I think we've seen that on the one hand, the shift from food aid to food assistance has kind of given greater flexibility in terms of responding to food crises, more tools, speedier, speedier responses in terms of local procurement, more appropriate responses. But at the same time, as Paul has pointed out, there's many challenges that still remain to be addressed. What I'd like to suggest in the discussion now is that maybe that we just focus on two of the key challenges, key areas of debate, and the first one being, what is food assistance? What should it be? What should it include? Is it just cash and food aid? Is it more than that? Seeds and tools, market support, livestock support? Is it more humanitarian? Is it development? Is it both? Does it matter? And secondly, after Ed's discussion, I'm sure there will be some questions, comments, thoughts on the future of the Food Aid Convention, in particularly about the objectives, membership, monitoring mechanisms. Should it be linked to WTO, to the DAC, or more generally development assistance, or the Committee on Food Security and a new food security architecture? All of these are kind of big issues that remain to be resolved. So maybe I could ask just for a first round of questions specifically on the area of food assistance, and questions, thoughts on what it means or should be. Yes, go ahead.
In situations of conflicts, it's reversed from food assistance to food aid. And in some extreme cases, food aid is even denied to people. For example, just right now, that is happening in Sri Lanka. And you spoke about food aid being denied in conflict situations. And last month, EU laid down conditions to Sri Lanka that it must abide by certain human rights conditions. But these have been recommendations over the last 30 years in International Commission of Jurists, Amnesty International, and the UN Human Rights Committee. So people have been neglecting it, and now it has come to a stage where people are locked up in camps and denied food. So what are we talking about? Day before yesterday here, they discussed about China is rising, EU is not rising. China is rising because it is not looking at human rights situations. Because EU started to look at human rights situations, now it has denied Sri Lanka tariff assistance. So can we all put these things together? Today we are talking about one corner of this problem, and tomorrow, yesterday another corner was discussed, day before yesterday another corner was discussed. Can we put all of these in a mind map and have it in front of our eyes and talk? Maybe we may talk about one corner, one aspect, but can we have all these in front of our eyes? That's how they are all related. And WFP, you are talking about WFP. 18 months ago, WFP official was reprimanded for saying that children are starving in northeast Sri Lanka. Last year, UNICEF spokesman was expelled for talking about children's starvation. So we need to put all these together.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just get a few more comments.
Would the questioners say who they are?
Yes,
yeah.
My name is Ian Buist. I'm a director of Interact Worldwide and also of Plan International UK. And I'm afraid I want to ask two broader questions. The first is in relation to the incidence of humanitarian problems. Seems to be inevitable to be growing because nobody has mentioned the impact of the huge rate of the increase of population, which is creating a retreat in some cases from market operations, which was quite successful, into other things. For instance, in Kenya during the last election, With this goes a huge influx of people into the towns. And it seems to me that, I'm not sure whether Edward has addressed this, but I noticed this famous word effective delivery. Now, there's a lot of concentration in the papers and in the presentations about what is to happen at the donor end, but what is going to be done in relation to the recipients. How, for instance, are they going to be discouraged from using any assistance which comes through in whatever form, or its monetary equivalent, in order to subsidise food prices for people who are relatively well off in the towns? Put it like that, I think that's the best way. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Two more? Or I thought there were more hands up.
One over there.
Okay.
And one there.
Yeah.
There we go, here first.
Thank you. To say who I am, I'm currently an independent consultant. Previously, I was a European Commission official, and my responsibilities included the DDA and the Food Aid Convention, which is why I dared to put my hand up to both questions. I wouldn't like actually to...
We might need a more volume to overcome the carnival. We have a carnival outside, so
I think do you want me to shout without this, or do you want to turn up the volume on this?
I don't know. Can we turn
talk
up
a bit
the
louder.
volume?
Okay. I just wanted to comment on the issue of the DDA, and also to mention two what I would call key political realities which are not likely to change and therefore will colour any negotiations, however you hide the reality in the ambiguous words that you use. Firstly, the texts in the DDA are not about the provision of food aid. They are about limiting the trade distortion effects of food aid, very ineffectively, I would say, but that's the object. And therefore, it doesn't in any way replace or remove the need for a convention specifically about the provision of food aid. Second point, there are strong disadvantages in the policies of both the US and the EU in relation to food aid, and it's difficult to see how one is going to meld the two to make it effective unless you simply continue to blur the distinction. For the US Congress, an essential objective of food aid is to improve the marketing of agricultural products from the United States, partly simply in terms of surplus disposal, but more subtly in terms of creating a market for future commercial sales. President Obama has recently committed himself to doubling American food exports, an impossible target, but I doubt very much whether he either could or would want to abandon anything which would help him towards that target. Therefore, increasing American exports will remain a fundamental part of American food aid policy. Incidentally, it's also a part of American domestic food aid policy, which is why, curiously, they have a food stamp policy whose only counterpart I can find anywhere else in the world is in India, where you have food aid for about half the population, partly to help the poor and partly to help Indian farmers. The EU has almost exactly the opposite situation, where food aid has been taken entirely outside agriculture, except occasionally when DG Agriculture is responsible for mobilizing food aid when it's going to be given in kind, unusually. But the EU's commitment to the Food Aid Convention is in cash. And this is why the volume goes down whenever the prices go up. And this is why there is less food aid in volume terms available when it is most required. So I'm not intending to answer how one melds those two, but I think unless you look at the fundamental political realities of the two biggest members of the Food Aid Convention, you won't get anywhere. It's not a matter of vocabulary, it's a matter of politics.
Maybe actually we'll have some responses now, because otherwise... Or
One more.
Okay, one more. Go on there.
Hi, yes, it's hopefully Chris Hayes. I'm a civil servant. Do you think the new convention should address the issue of maintaining a capacity to deal with large volumes of food. You've got sort of the increasing shift to cash. You've got the obviously partnerships building up between, say, TNT and I believe it was WFP. But could the budget actually be looking at maintaining the staffing level, the staffing expertise, so when a large influx of actual food volume is required, it's still there?
No, do you want to start with the food aid convention questions, or why don't you do that and then we'll...
All right. Well, I mean, excellent interventions and excellent questions. Food aid and the Doha development round, absolutely correct, of course, is that the WTO agreement is all about limiting export competition through state assistance. What I suppose I'm suggesting is if we have an agreement which sets out how that is to take place and the arrangements under a Committee of Agriculture to do that, there's no very good reason anymore why the operation of food aid otherwise needs to be caught up in that agreement, because all that's required is a reference to that agreement and say these are the rules and that you're supposed to abide by these rules. If somebody thinks you're not abiding by these rules, they can take a complaint to the Committee on Agriculture. And therefore, what I'm suggesting, it means that the food aid or food assistance can be organised as an agreement in its own terms without necessarily being part of that, if you like, trade architecture, which it is at the moment. That's a reasonable consideration. If that was so, then you could think of moving to it being part of, I say, either the broader DAC or the food security architecture in Rome. If I were to come to my list of what I think would make more sense at the end, my own inclination is very clearly that it makes more sense as a funder agreement. Excuse me, I should have turned this off. And it makes more sense to perceive it as part of that development and humanitarian architecture, because it can then relate to all that, and these issues of effectiveness, after all, do come up under that architecture. This is why you have the Paris Declaration and the whole Paris Declaration process, for example, in terms of effectiveness. US and EU, yes, of course, this is part of the whole thing, and what one's looking for is some way of finding some common ground between those two parties. But I will also say there are now increasingly other parties outside as well who ought to be taken into account. Those are clearly important, but there are others out there as well, and one should consider them. The US Congress, yes, it is true. Interestingly, the US government itself has been trying very hard, with limited success so far, to try and find itself some margin of manoeuvre in terms of doing things for humanitarian assistance other than through using agriculture resources. So presently, US AID has managed to get itself something around $350 million appropriation, which can be used for acquiring food outside the United States, which is an interesting development. And that's recent development. What one has to say, since they managed to get that far, there could be some presumption that that might continue and become more important in the future, even if the other food aid is there and very difficult to deal with. The EU side, indeed, what the EU has done, as you've correctly said, has essentially changed its food aid budget lines so that they are quite flexible, and as you can see from the ECHO definition of food assistance, we'll come back to that, they're determined on making them as flexible as possible, so that those budget lines, which were originally intended for European cereals and skim milk powder and butter oil, can now be used for virtually any kind of food security intervention in a humanitarian or developmental context, particularly humanitarian context. So that's clearly the direction in which they're going. And the question is, can you find some common ground between those two positions? And I come back to, it seems to me the way you try to find common ground is if you can agree on some common objectives and then discuss what you individually intent on contributing towards achieving those common objectives. So you have to work back from the objectives rather than asking, well, what have we got available, what can we do with it? It does seem to me you have to work the other way round, and that to me does imply an attempt to rethink the Food Aid Convention. You won't get there if all you do is relabel it a food assistance convention, and if you say, all right, if you want to, you can provide cash, and if you want to, you can provide commodities. It does seem to me you have to come back to and rethink the architecture. You've raised an interesting question. Capacities do with large volumes of food. Of course, what we're talking about here is the operational agencies, and the fact that the operational agencies, for example, World Food Programme, do not have any regular budget. They are dependent effectively on a commission earned on the food which flows through the organisation. The direction of your sort of question, as part of reconsidering this architecture, is whether this issue of the United Nations and WFP in particular ought to have some regular commitments of resources which are effectively for supporting the infrastructure of the organisation, the infrastructure of providing assistance on a global basis as and when it might be. The other thing I'd then say is we now live in a world of incredibly integrated markets. So actually, and the WFP people tell you themselves, if they want to ship food aid, of course, to some interior difficult place in Sudan, that's one matter. But if they're talking about large quantities of food to Mombasa or to Dar es Salaam or Chittagong and Kolna Port for Bangladesh, you can literally use a telex. We don't use telex anymore, but you could use a mobile phone, you could use computers, and you could get the grain industry to move very large quantities of food very quickly. So you don't necessarily need a large physical infrastructure for moving large quantities of food around the world. The problems arrive where you've got particular kinds of logistical difficulties in addressing large-scale problems if they come up very quickly in some difficult place, or continuing to provide support to places which are difficult of access, like Darfur.
Any quick comments? Oh, sorry.
Okay, yeah, I'll be quick. Clearly, Sri Lanka raises huge humanitarian dilemmas for all sorts of international actors, and I'm not qualified to speak about them. Suzanne might be, but we'd be getting off the subject of the meeting. The second point about whether or not there'll be a growing humanitarian caseload, I guess relates to some extent to Ed's point about the fact if you were to denominate it in sort of numbers of people you ought to help, then partly that's a guesstimate about numbers of people that are likely to need to be helped year on year. The assumption tends to be that it's growing for all sorts of reasons. Climate change tends to get cited a lot, and of course there are issues around population growth. You need to be slightly careful with that. On the one hand, there are things happening that suggest that there might be more humanitarian crisis. On the other hand, there are things happening that suggest there might be fewer, at least crises that need international humanitarian aid. Not least, historically high numbers of people coming out of poverty in some countries where development is happening successfully, and therefore less need for international assistance. So the assumption that the humanitarian caseload, international aid for which international aid is needed, will always continue to grow, I think you need to be careful with. But it tends to be a sort of truism of things you read. There will be more and more humanitarian crises. The political realities point, yes, of course, US food aid and indeed other countries' food aid is an intensely political process. What's going to happen to shift it is political. But I think that's what's interesting, and what Ed was talking about a bit, that it's an interesting political moment in terms of US food aid policy, and that there are starting to be some shifts around the edges of what's possible in terms of influencing Congress and the administration. My sort of personal analogy to it is a sort of sandcastle. You're not going to get very far from trying to sort of stamp on the sandcastle of US food policy, but there's starting to be some water lapping around the edges that might undermine bits of its current illogicalities. Capacity volumes, Ed's made most of the points I'd make. WFP's sort of recognised strength is around logistics, its ability to move things and deliver things. And certainly that's what donors see as its most valuable comparative advantage and would like it to continue having. There is an issue with how effectively they fund it to do that and ways that could be improved, which Ed was talking about. There's also an issue with whether or not you see the sort of increasing dominance of WFP as a problem. If you look further back in time, other international aid agencies, notably the big NGOs, probably did more food aid, and WFP's become more dominant, and that might or might not be a problem. Sort of other organisations' capacity to move large volumes of things is less clear. That was it.
Thank you. If I may just add one more point about Sri Lanka, I think the one aspect that is relevant or related to the study is the growing importance of non-DAC donors and the implications that has for providing food aid as part of humanitarian assistance. But this is, I mean, as we point out in our report, it is a very under-researched area and certainly something that needs more looking into. But I shouldn't be commenting as a chair, so I'll invite some more questions and comments. Yes, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Wait for the microphone.
Good afternoon. My name is Shaheen Chuptai. I'm a humanitarian policy advisor with Oxfam. I just want to, I know you said at the beginning that you didn't have answers as such, but I'm going to try and press you for some anyway. Going back to actually one of the final points that you made, and it's been picked up by some of the speakers, the issue that irrespective of what the commitments look like, whether they're commodity commitments or cash commitments, that they need to be meaningfully clear in terms of what we actually want to achieve on the ground, what we want to achieve for people. And there has been some discussion about having them expressed as a sort of unit of people for a period of time who you're going to then feed nutritionally, and some terms have been bandied around such as person years. And I wanted to sort of ask to what extent you see that as a practical development, and whether there are any lessons or challenges that in fact can be transferred and learned from other sectors. And related to that point, with the same kind of question, the question of protecting cash commitments, obviously it's very important. We've seen how in the past, when there has been high price volatility, contributing countries have basically become scared that they're facing an open-ended commitment, and that still represents a challenge. And those of us who are trying to encourage positive revisions to the FAC, in scratching our heads over this, want to see what would be the best way forward, and looked at potential sort of tools such as commercial insurance so that part of the cash commitment goes to commercial insurance to protect the rest of the cash commitment, and not transfer the price risk to recipients. And again, it's the same question to how do we see that? Is that a practical option? Is there something more practical, and are there any lessons from another sector that we could apply? Thanks.
Behind you.
Hi, my name is Yasmin Hardy. I work for HLSP, so I'm coming at this from a health point of view. My question was for the first speaker on the food assistance link to nutrition. You made a couple of points about trends towards looking at the quality of nutritional supplements, and one of your challenges was to focus on the nutritional outcomes of food assistance and link this to nutrition strategies. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about how far this has been missing in the past, and why, and who is leading the relinking in the future.
Hello, my name is Carl. I'm the Hunger Team Leader at Care International UK. My question is regarding perhaps to take this discussion a little bit away from the processes such as the cluster, the committee, the convention, and think more about not so much the solutions that we're talking about, perhaps the problems, the vulnerabilities, and how governance can play a role in informing how we do things better. And I'm thinking, Paul, you talked a little bit about the high-level task force and the comprehensive framework for action. And that seems to me to be, though the other processes are important, but the comprehensive framework for action seems to be the initiative with not just the backing of the Secretary General of the UN and therefore states party to the UN, but it has been a consultative process in that African, southern governments and more importantly southern civil society has been involved in. There's been consultation with groups affected by food insecurity and hunger, and I'm wondering whether we should give that more attention and link it to the issue of rights, which has already been raised and that you mentioned as well, Paul, the right to food, because it's increasingly evident that perhaps the delivery of the right to food or the attainment of the right to food can happen with better governance and better consultation processes such as the comprehensive framework for action.
Yeah, let's take one more and then.
Thank you. Jonathan Game from World Vision. I just want to sort of follow on from some of Shaheen's questions about when there's only one option of food aid, choosing the solution is quite easy. When there's a whole toolbox full, who should be choosing? And if it's to be the communities, then how can we have agreements that maintain that sort of right for the community or for the host government to choose the most appropriate solution?
Great. Paul, do you want to start?
Okay. Yeah, I'll start with nutrition, sort of conscious of something of a lack of expertise. But so what was missing? I mean, all sorts of things. One of the areas where something interesting is happening, I think, is around supplementary feeding. And the problem there has been a lack of attention to sort of coverage and outcomes and inappropriate foodstuffs. So people generally got corn soy blend as a supplementary ration, and it's just not particularly effective at treating moderate malnutrition. And sort of spurred on by the shift to we don't call it CTC anymore. What do we call it? CMAM, Community Managed Acute Malnutrition, with its attention to coverage and to sort of outcomes. That's starting to translate, I think, into supplementary feeding, and there's starting to be both better products, so look at the sort of inadequacy of CSB and what you could provide that would be more appropriate, and to different approaches, including a greater attention to coverage. So I think that's promising. Then more generally, a look at sort of the nutritional quality of food aid through what types of food assistance are provided more broadly, both micronutrient supplementation, but sort of beyond that. And so the USAID, I think, are funding a big food aid quality review being undertaken by Tufts. And so there's various sort of interlocking things that are happening, of which those are some. The comprehensive framework for action, more attention to rights. Yeah, I mean, clearly there's a much bigger question about how you tackle hunger and food insecurity and what are the most appropriate ways of doing that. And food assistance is part of that, and I guess what we've been talking about is how that might be a sort of more effective part of that. But there are bigger questions to be asked, really. The toolbox question, the idea that the recipient communities to choose the most appropriate instrument is admirable, but a long way from reality, I think. And so, in practice, sort of better appropriateness and selection of how you tackle hunger and food insecurity. I mean, there are a number of things, aren't there? One of them is, I guess, better assessment practice, and in particular, a move away from sort of resource-driven assessment. So rather than counting how much food aid people need, a attempt to discover what the problem is and think about what the best range of options for responding to that are. And there are some promising things happening with respect to that, the development of sort of response analysis frameworks, having response analysis and the analysis of a range of different response options as a sort of a core part of the assessment process. And so there's a lot more to be done, but I certainly think, 5 years ago I did a study called According to Need, and the basic finding of that around needs assessments was that they were completely resource driven. That's starting to be less true. And so there are some promising shifts. On the, Ed's got his own view, which he was talking about on the food aid or food assistance convention around, can you denominate it in terms of sort of numbers of people you're trying to help? And that would be interesting, and there are all sorts of sort of devils in the detail of how you could achieve it. Personally, budgets are increasingly cash based. It slightly fails to escape me why you wouldn't want to do this on a cash basis, and to get over the problem of price changes by index linking it. We link our pensions to, I'm going to say retail price index and realise it's about to change. We link our pensions to prices. It shouldn't be beyond the bounds possibility to link a commitment to tackle hunger and food insecurity to changes in food prices. But Ed may have more of a view on that.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll begin with that. It seems to me if people make financial commitments, then you have to specify some kind of basket or index or whatever. If those are to be real commitments and they're not to be vulnerable to eroded by price and currency fluctuations. So I don't think what Paul is suggesting is very different from what I'm suggesting. It seems to me the idea of, if you like, you try to feed so many people, it pushes you towards defining some kind of index or basket of things which you define in real terms, and then you can ask the question each year, in terms of the commitments we are making this year, what are the implications of the cost of that basket in terms of current expenditure? That would be a quite different view of the Food Aid Convention. In other words, it moves from simply saying, oh, well, actually what we did last year was this, to a convention whereby what you do is you indicate what your commitments are going to be in the coming year, and then indeed subsequently you can say, well, this is actually what we did disperse, and that can be reviewed. Unless you move in that direction, it seems to me you have nothing really that you can focus on in terms of assessing effectiveness, which was the issue you raised. And it's interesting in the wording, they talk about effectiveness, but they also talk about appropriateness, because it does seem to me, as soon as you mention appropriateness, you are into this issue of what is quantitatively and qualitatively an appropriate diet, ration, whatever you want to call it, requirement for crisis-affected people. So it seems to me there's a logic in going in that particular direction. It seems to me the advantages of, to the extent that you can, imagining these to be financial commitments in relation to that, it avoids the problem of, one of you alluded to, the single golf club. Well, here's the problem, but the only thing we can use is food aid. If we think of recent humanitarian crises, for example, the 2004 December tsunami, let's say the Kashmir earthquake, a characteristic of these particular crises is actually most of the people affected didn't need food aid. They didn't need food aid. It didn't mean that they didn't have problems of acquiring food, but what they didn't need was directly transferred food to them, and they didn't need internationally acquired and imported food in order to do this. So it does seem to me move in the direction of envisaging commitments which are more flexible, make it more likely that there can be a better match between people's needs, people's rights, and what is available from those who are providing the funding. There's a long gap between the one and the other, but it seems to me that's what you're trying to do, move in that direction, with all the difficulties about the US and the European Union. It's a very hard road to go, but it seems to me you shouldn't abandon it. And the last thing in the slide, I didn't go to the end, it says at the very end, actually if anything is to be achieved in this area, it will not be achieved by expecting officials to get together to discuss their responsibilities on an operational day-to-day basis, bringing them together, it will have to go to a much higher level. It will have to be, it does say ministers, and it seems to me if you want to bring about significant change in this area, then what we have to look for is a willingness of some government or some governments to be prepared to take an initiative at a much higher level to try and bring about change. It won't be achieved by getting civil servants who regularly meet twice a year in London to discuss the Food Aid Convention to talk about how it might be renegotiated and how it might be reformed. I think all the lessons of history is if you want to achieve some major change, you have to step upwards to a much higher level and recognise this is a political issue and it can't be handled on a business as usual basis. I don't know whether any of you who have been former civil servants in the UK or the European Union would agree, but I think that seems to me is the missing ingredient in the G7 statement so far. Does it literally mean it's going to be at a ministerial level, or does it mean it's passed back down to those who are holding the file?
Thank you. It's 2:30, so I think I've got to end it there. But I think we've demonstrated even more all the remaining challenges and issues and issues to be resolved and solutions to be found to the problems of food assistance, food security. I guess I'd just like to end up by saying that it isn't just an interesting kind of theoretical or technical issue, because the default option would be basically to allow food aid to become increasingly irrelevant, but to have nothing else in place. And in a context where problems of food security are likely to get worse rather than better in the future, I think we really can't allow that to happen. So finding a way of addressing these many challenges is really, really important, I think. That's